So whether or not you had some interesting times with your traditions over Christmas, you're still involved in traditions every day of your life, even the way you spent the New Year, whether you've already made resolutions and busted them, broke them, or didn't, or decided why make them because I can't keep them. That's a tradition too. Traditions affect our lives in so many ways, and they can affect us in really positive ways, but they can also affect us in significant ways that damage our spiritual life and that damage the spiritual life of people around us. So, yeah, if anybody else needs. Is it important that we understand what they are and how they affect us? Well, it's important because we are all affected by that. When we set the time to come in today, and we say, well, church starts at 10:45. That tradition actually is a tradition that began because the way people. Anybody here been on a dairy farm? Okay, so dairy farmers start milking their cows about 4:30 in the morning, and they finish about well, it depends on how many cows and how much help they have, but it can be about 9:30. So by the time they get themselves cleaned up and come to church, it's about 10:45. So that's how the time came where churches have this 10:45, 10:30, whatever it is, 11 o'clock. Now, I know some of you are surprised that there's a time that we start. So I remember always having to say, and I still have to say, is this American time or is this African time? But do you guys remember what my saying was when you first came 10 years ago? Time is money. that was how to try to tell people that you have to be at work on time because the boss doesn't like it when you come in 2 hours after start time. So a tradition can be this. They can be long. They can have started long ago. They can have started a short time ago. They can be traditions in our country. They can be traditions in our family. They can be traditions in our church. How do you determine the value of them? Well, to determine the value, it's important to kind of know how they started and where they started. But the value of them doesn't always indicate the impact of them. So when we stopped talking about this, or I 2 weeks ago when I left off, I said that weighing traditions is a very, very tricky business. It is a lot like, let's see here, I was going to say, it's a lot like going over an old bridge and you're unsure of whether that bridge is going to hold you or not. Because people get very, very defensive about their traditions. And yet the truth of the matter is, as we kind of concluded in leaving off, traditions do change, even though that word is one of those words that's kind of right in the face of tradition. And I gave you some examples. Jesus changed traditions. So he took the Passover, which we are going to celebrate a part of today, and he made the Passover, which was a once-a-year thing, into a regular thing where he took the elements and said, this is my body and this is my blood. So he took a tradition and reshaped it into something that we're practicing today. But we're not celebrating the entire Passover meal. We're celebrating a small part of it that the church has repeated for 2,000 years. But Jesus also did away with some traditions. We don't have to follow the special dietary laws of the Old Testament. You can't, have milk with your steak. That's one of the laws in the Old Testament. Why? Well, there was some reason for that, but what we know is the Bible tells us that these things were a shadow of the thing that was to come, and that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. So we don't practice those things anymore. We don't. We even talked about the Sabbath and how Jewish folks meet on Saturday. But early Christians began, particularly non-Jewish Christians, which would be what we're talking about here, non-Jewish Christians, the majority of people started meeting on the day of the week where Jesus was resurrected, which was Sunday. And so that became a tradition, but also it was a tension in the early church because Jewish folks had the long tradition of Saturday, and they said, what is wrong with these new people? They don't want to meet on Saturday. Let me say something kind of off to the side about that. Sunday is a pressure day now. And so there are people who aren't here today because they can't be because they work. There was a time in the culture where the tradition was not to have stores open on Sunday. Now it's probably the busiest shopping day of the week. So there's a tradition that, at least the cultural part of it, I wish we still had, but we don't. So I say all of that to say that traditions can have good things, they can be changed, but we need to weigh them for a lot of reasons. One is that if we do not weigh them, we stand in real risk and jeopardy of allowing the tradition to take the place of Jesus being the center of our lives. So let's look over, and you're going to be probably on about page 6 here, I think. Let's see here. Oh, I've got 2 different files. Where does it say a stern warning about traditions? You have that in your on page 4. Okay. So I have more notes than you have, so that's why. So here's a stern warning about traditions. Therefore, as you have received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him, established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. For in him the whole fullness of deity dwells bodily, and you have been filled in him, who is the head of all rule and all authority. Traditions can capture us, and they can become the controlling authority of our lives. Okay, let's just give some examples. Okay, so when you walked in today, we had a time that we started. That time is a tradition. But could that time change? Could it change and there be anything wrong with it changing? For some folks, it could be. When you walked in today, you had a certain part of the church that you gravitated towards. It was like you were pulled to your pew. Because most of you, people say, well, how do you know who's there? Because I know which pew they're in. Because folks come in, and there's a certain way. In fact, we were in Titusville last week, Titusville, Pennsylvania, not warm Titusville, Florida, but in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and we came in, and I said to my wife, I wanted to mix it up today. She said, what do you mean? I wanted to sit on the other side of the church and see what the people were like over there. But we tended to, we've gone numbers of times to this church, we tend to go to the same section, the same 2 or 3 pews. Some of you are much more precise about which pew it is, right? You count them. 1, 2, 3, we're in 5 today. So what happens if you come in and somebody's in that pew? You say move, right? Do you know that the Free Methodist Church, which we are a part of the lay folks in the church rebelled against the idea because in the earlier part of in the 1800s, in that century and before, people would buy a pew. So in order to have a pew, you would have the Boniface pew. You'd slap your name on the side, and it would be your pew. So if you weren't in church, no one sat in your pew without your permission. Now, the group of lay people in the late 1850s and eventually 1860 decided that really wasn't a very friendly thing to people coming from the outside because there were very few seats that were free in the church. So you had, the tradition was you had your pew. It came from grandma and grandpa or great-grandma and grandpa, and you sat in the pew. But those who were poor, who didn't have money, didn't have finances, they either had to stand or sit in the very few free pews that maybe were way in. Isn't it amazing? The free pews were in the back. Everybody, I always love it when people want to sit in the front, because that's, you know, if you go to, if I was a rock star, you'd all want to be in the front, right? No one wants to be close to the preacher because they might get hit with something. I don't know what it is. But this idea of pews then was that tradition was challenged as being a tradition that was not following Jesus Christ. And you know what happened? They got thrown out of the, would have been Methodist Episcopal Church as a result of it. For that and for opposing slavery. So that's how we got the name Free. It wasn't meant to be a nice name. It was meant to be a name of derision. So traditions must at times change, but they have to be reviewed to find out why. How did this start, and what did it end up being? Now maybe it ended up being a fundraising idea, like how do we get pews? Well, gee, would you like to buy a pew? Yes. Would you like to buy a pew? Yes. And then somehow the pews became property. The controlling authority of our lives then becomes the tradition and not Jesus Christ. That is the danger. And it is a real danger in our lives. So when they always say that the 5 last words of the church are, 6 words. We never did it that way. It must be 7 words. We never did it that way before. That's when you challenge your tradition, right? That you say, golly, now I'm not going to do this, so don't get your hopes up. If I were to say, let's start church at 11:30, that would not make some of you ever be any earlier than you are. So, you know, there's an axiom about how long it takes you to get to church. The further away you live, the more likely you are to be on time. And the closer you live, the more likely you are to be late. Now throw a couple kids in there, and you know, anybody has small kids, you just have an excuse. You have an excuse. You don't have small kids, you're the excuse, okay? So if you're going to change the time, some folks will say, I don't like the change. Well, why? I don't know. That's the time we always meet. Let's go milk some cows and come to church. So challenging those traditions, you ask, okay, so why do we do it? Those are really important questions. And one of the things I spent some time about previously was saying, culture has this huge weight on us, so we do things really without thinking why we do them. And why we do them ultimately can push us away from Jesus Christ. The second thing there is traditions can displace the authority of God in our lives and in the lives of people we serve. So that was the Free Methodist problem. They said, okay, this tradition places a hardship on the people we're trying to reach for Jesus, because they can't accommodate that. They're not going to come and buy a pew. They don't, or they're poor and can't afford a pew. So what do we say? If you're poor, you take the back seats, and only the wealthy can sit in the front. Well, wait a minute. That displaces serving Jesus, but it displaces the people we're trying to serve. So I really want that to be in your mind, because the tradition might be important to you, and it might be okay. But you must ask the question, how does this tradition affect other people around me? Has this tradition become a burden for people coming to Jesus Christ? Has it become a stumbling block for people coming to Jesus Christ? Now, why is that important? That's important because we're going to go into this long scripture, and we won't get through it all today. But lesser traditions tend to take us captive. The problem is we don't know that they're lesser because we've done them for so long. As a result of that, because we've practiced it over and over and over again for so long, we don't realize that its value is not as great as we hold. So let's look at what we have here in Matthew chapter 7. And Jesus is going to take these folks on head on, but let me say, we're going to read this. Don't look at it and say, look at those people, how bad they are. The question is, how does this apply to my life, and how does it apply to your life? Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those who enter who are trying to. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? Now remember, this is all Jesus talking here. You also say, in verse 18, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. There's an interesting way to look at things. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee! First clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees! You hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside they are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous, and you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Just a little note the irony, these are the people who killed Jesus. Okay, so, all right, so he has some pretty rough things to say to them. But those rough things are not intended just for them. They are intended for us. Because every organization, as it has time to live and grow, begins to practice things, sometimes that are wonderful and helpful, and sometimes we practice things that aren't so helpful. So let's look at, we're going to kind of begin to decompress this part of the scripture and talk about how traditions can take us captive. First of all, A, by making the tradition burdensome with the mistaken view that the heavier and more unpleasant it is, the greater its value must be. So somehow there is a mindset that if we do something and we really don't like it, it must really be good for us. It's kind of, I don't know if you've ever had castor oil. Okay, they give castor oil if your digestive system isn't quite working right. So In an earlier part of the century, if your digestive system wasn't quite working the way you wanted it to, they would give you castor oil. Castor oil does not taste like Pepto-Bismol. It is terrible. I mean, you can still buy it. It is terrible. You'd think it would make you sick rather than help you. And the thought is, in fact, there's a whole song about it. Just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down, the medicine go down, the medicine go down. Just a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down in the most delightful way. So the worse it tastes, the better it must be for you. And sometimes with traditions, we do stuff and then we're like, I don't like this. This just doesn't work, but it's good for us. It's good for us. Talking with a pastor recently, and there are very few churches that have Sunday night services anymore. And the reason is it's so difficult to have them because of people's schedules. People working, people because they work 6 days a week, and Sunday they want to worship, but they've got other things they need to do with their families and with their kids. And so Sunday night service was a tradition. In fact, when I started as a pastor, there was the big three. Well, there was actually the big four. There was Sunday school, worship service, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, the big four. And there were even seminars on the big four, and why you needed to have the big four, and why it was important to have the big four. Well, the big four is really difficult to do. But this pastor was sharing this idea that he has been talking with the leaders of his church and saying, we've got say, I don't want to identify the church, but say it has 100 people on Sunday morning, but 5 come out to Sunday night. And the 5 people who come out to Sunday night aren't the people who are the decision-making people. So the pastor's saying, maybe we need to do something different. Nope, can't do anything different. Why? Because we've always had Sunday night service. And of course, the question that I would want to ask and would want to ask to the leaders to say, then why aren't you there? Right? Because we put the burden on someone else to do it, but we're not willing to take the weight of it on ourselves. And so we make it an unpleasant thing. Now, I think Sunday, you could do something on Sunday, and it could be very meaningful, but there have to be, you got to be committed to it, right? So, they say, if you're leading and nobody's following, you're just taking a walk. So if you're having a service and nobody comes, then you probably better adjust your strategy and not keep it just because that's the way you always did it. But there is this mindset somehow, and it goes way beyond the church. If it really is unpleasant, it must really be good. And that's just not the case. But the Pharisees somehow had a way to make things extremely burdensome. Let me say something about habits and practices. It is far easier to have a rigid practice that you do repeatedly than it is to keep your heart fresh before God. So I know folks, and you know folks, who are very rigid about going to service on, say, Saturday or Sunday, week after week after week after week after week. They never miss, and a church that has floating times where they can go, they go, but they're not drawing closer to Christ. But they are keeping a repetitious pattern. And sometimes you say, well, how are you this week? Well, I went to church. How was it? It was terrible. I was there. I'm faithful to go. Well, if it's terrible, then maybe we need to revisit why it's terrible. But now, a spoonful of sugar, right? So we keep terrible because sometimes in our minds we've gotten convinced that somehow it's better. Let's look at the next one. By emphasizing the value of the tedious and the technical, over truth and honesty. So I was looking at verse 13 through 15. The tedious and the technical over truth and honesty. So here's the summary of what the Pharisees were saying. They said if you made a promise, they're using the word oath. An oath is a promise. So I say, okay, you're standing with somebody, and you're standing there, and you say, okay, I'm going to sell you this cow, and I will sell it to you for $100. And the other person says, well, is it a good cow? You say, well, I swear by the temple that that cow is as healthy as the day is long. I mean, it's a great cow. And then so you make the transition, you sell the cow, and then the guy gets the cow home, and the cow just drops over dead. And he says to you, you promised me that that cow was a good cow. And you say, well, wait a second. He said, you even swore on the temple that it's... Well, I didn't swear on the gold on the temple. I almost think Jesus was thinking about lawyers here, right? Because lawyers, it's all about technicality. So over the years, I have written contracts. And I used to have rental properties. And so when I had rental properties, I don't have any anymore, thankfully. But what I did, I looked at other people, and other people had contracts that were like 3 pages long. My contract was like 16 pages long. Because I tried to cover every technicality in there, but there's one technicality you can't cover. That's people, right? Because people just do whatever they want to, and the tedious doesn't matter to them. Here Jesus says there was this idea of trying to fine-tune and say, well, you didn't quite do it exactly right. If you didn't swear on the gold of the temple, that oath doesn't mean anything. And that becomes the thing of highest value. Not being truthful about the oath. So Jesus is saying, Jesus on all of this, in fact, the last part here, and it's a little bit out of the range of what I gave there. He says, if anyone swears by heaven, swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. So Jesus says, you get lost in the technical thing, and you miss the most important things. And that is the problem with tradition. So that, okay, so let's go, Christmas has already passed, but say the tradition is every year, I think fruitcake is much maligned, so I'm gonna malign it myself for a second here, so just for point of illustration. You know what a fruitcake is? A fruitcake is, depending on how, it's a round object that lives for many years on its own. So it is made up sometimes of, I've actually had some really good fruitcake, but imagine for a second you have it, and there is a fruitcake, and it has like candied fruit inside it. It's a real heavy, dense kind of a thing, and every year you give a fruitcake to your mother. And every year, you give it to her at Christmas, every year at July, it's still sitting on her table. And in the next July, it's still sitting on the table, but you bring another one. And you do that because your parents also did the same thing to their mother. They brought a fruitcake, but no one ever asked Mom, Mom, do you like fruitcake? And Mom would say, no, I don't like fruitcake, but it's good to keep the door open in the summertime, keep the screen door open. So the technical part of it becomes more important than you want to give a gift to your mom, right? You want a gift that matters to your mom. Jesus is trying to help us understand that there's nothing wrong with patterns. Patterns are important in our life. We need patterns. We need routine. One of the things, even being away from the church for a week, is I come to realize, there's a certain routine that I'm in, and I do best when I'm in that routine. I kind of know what's next, what's coming, what needs to be done, and I stay focused in that routine. So there's nothing wrong with routine, but the problem is when the routine becomes so specific that we forget how it is to live and serve Jesus Christ. So I want you to really take the opportunity and think about at least these 2 points here. By making traditions burdensome with a mistaken view. So if your tradition is burdensome, you need to ask, why is it burdensome? Why does it seem so hard to follow it and keep it? And what's the point? Is it drawing me, we'll talk about, does it draw us closer to Christ? And the second thing is, have we lifted up how tedious it is and the value of that over truthfulness and honesty? Are those the most important things to us? Does this tradition work to bring truth and light to things, or are we so technically tied to it that we're just a slave to the technicality of it? Which could be something like 10:45. 10:45 is the time we start. Now, as a pastor, at 10:45, I would like to start then. That is really important to me. But since my blood pressure is already high, probably getting upset about not starting at 10:45 is not going to be much help to me. So we have to decide, is that the best time to start? Maybe it's not. Is the starting time the most important thing? It's not. I want it to be, because I'm a type A personality. Type A personalities love things to be lined up. However, Hebrews tells us not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together, but it does not say at 10:45. Rats. I wish it did, but it does not. So therefore, that part has to be flexible. We'll talk more about this as we continue on in the weeks to come. Let's bow our heads together in prayer, and we're going to prepare for the Lord's Supper today. Lord Jesus, thank you for your mercy and grace in our lives, and for the opportunity to follow you. We think of many practices that we do that are good and wholesome and helpful, and then we think of other things that we need to step back and say, what can help us to follow you better? We don't want to be held captive to something that doesn't lift you up. So give us freedom from those things and courage to follow you in fresh ways in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray.